Welcome back to Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm here with my co-host, ExoAcademian. It's good to be back with all of you who are listening. Exo, how's it going?
It's going great. This is going to be a fun topic tonight, and I know it'll be interesting for the people out there and interesting for us.
Absolutely. Tonight's topic is a little bit of a loaded one. It's not a topic that I think everyone particularly likes to talk about when you think about ufology. Some people, on the other hand, like to talk about it quite a bit. I recognize, and I think you do as well, that this topic is a little bit of a loaded one, that for some people, it I think kind of brings in a little bit of a third rail for some. And so, as we talked about kind of before we started, we really want to sort of ask for the charity of the audience here, that they kind of bear with us as we work our way through this material, and know that we are trying to go to a certain place. We're trying to take everyone on a little bit of a journey, both the journey that we each have gone through, but also how we look at this material now. And with that being said, we'll just get right into it. So we are going to talk about angels and demons on this episode. Exo, just saying it out loud, I realize how much of a sort of loaded topic that really is. I know you've done an episode on this. I think it was a little bit midway through the life of your podcast. So you've got some thoughts on it. I was wondering if you would be willing to kind of start us off and talk to some degree about your own journey with this topic, maybe outside of ufology, but of course with ufology as well.
Yeah, sure. And I think what's interesting about this is, depending on your background, you'll either understand or be flummoxed by how some people approach this, because the angels and demons topic to some people seems like, not related to ufology. Like, what's that got to do with aliens and spacecraft, and interdimensionals? And yet there are some people coming at it thinking it's got everything in the world to do with it, because basically, these ETs or these aliens or these interdimensionals are actually, demons in disguise, or these nefarious spiritual figures in disguise that are referenced in historical spiritual traditions like Christianity in the Bible, right? In terms of where it is in Scripture. So this is a tricky one. Some people will be even a bit triggered, I think, by this topic, either in the positive or the negative. Some people will sort of be like, "This, well, that's religion. This has got nothing to do with this. I don't want to hear about that." At the same time, when you look at some of the experiences people have, whether either positive or negative, there's always this discussion of the spiritual element, that even researchers who go in, like when Hynek and Vallée went in and talked to people, even John Keel, they weren't going in looking for a spiritual interpretation of what happened to people. They weren't going in assuming these were celestial figures that they encountered. They were thinking they had some sort of experience with perhaps an extraterrestrial, like we've discussed before. For Hynek and Vallée, that was the beginning hypothesis, right? But it was the nature of the experiences people had, how it changed them, how it changed their perspective on reality and who they are. And even when we look at the free data that came out, it talked about people's perspective on life and material goods and everything, how they relate to other people. Everything changed. Again, some for the negative, some for the positive. I'm not suggesting it's all positive experiences. I think that does a disservice to the data whenever we try and do that. But within that totality, there's often a spiritual element that's very common. So I think sooner or later you have to dive into this, right? So that's what we're gonna dive in now. I think we're going to look at it from many different perspectives, because I think you have to sort of try and wrap your head around it, do justice to the data. It's also interesting because when you and I talked about first starting up this podcast, we both have Christianity as part of our background. And what I also want to inform people out there about is that that can mean many different things. You know, say if you're not coming from a Christian background, saying you are coming from a Christian background can mean many different things. Of course, in Americana, it's to some degree been, welded to the fabric of the national identity for some people, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we're going to talk about it beyond that kind of parameter. But for me, I'll just give a quick intro and then jump it over to you so you can give yours as well. So part of my life has been, at one point I identified as a Christian. It's not so much that I don't identify as a Christian now. I'm just more sort of universalist. I'm very spiritually minded. I'm as informed by Zen Buddhism as I am by contemplative Christianity, and sort of follow the good Buddhist notion that, if you're Buddhist, you don't call yourself a Buddhist, kind of thing, and same thing with Christianity. Like the terms are not really helpful. I don't find. So what I will say is that I'm a spiritual person. Again, some people want to draw this hard line between spiritual versus religious. I think it's more murky than that. I've had sort of official traditional religion in my background, as well as much more, loose affiliation, kind of a smorgasbord of taking a bit of that, a bit of this. And that's more where I am now. But at one point in my late teens, I became what I would call an evangelical Christian, and have been in sort of several different modalities within that. So I've been everything from a Southern Baptist to a charismatic Christian, even Eastern Orthodox for a period of time. So quite a range, Pentecostal, Presbyterian for a while. So really, it's almost like I was making sure I stopped in every room of the house. And so I've been in places where the spiritual experience was in some ways reduced to references to things that happened to people in a book, right? And that's sort of more one way of looking at it for some Christian traditions. Other ones, very much things were happening in real time. In the more charismatic circles, things were happening. People were having spiritual experiences, not just individuals, but entire groups of people were having things. And those were not just like psychosomatic kind of projections of people. These really were experiences. And I think those experiences actually prepped me for some understandings of what's going on with the phenomenon, because they're not as disalike as some people think. So that's what I would say as a brief introduction, is that I've had spiritual experiences in more traditional Christian circles that actually helped prep me for experiences with the phenomenon, and experiences that I couldn't put in a box. And I would say that it's interesting how the frameworks we use, the framing again, right, that we apply to these experiences has as much to do with what we take away from them as the nature of the experience itself, which was interesting when we talk about, maybe we can get into this later, how different people take different things out of their experiences, even with the phenomenon, and talking about how our own interpretive framework feeds into that. So that's what I would say for me. How about for you?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey for me as well. So I do approach this topic with that context, a similar context, and this is partly why we get along so well, as we do share, I think, a little bit of a common fabric and a way of thinking as well about these issues. I come at this from a Christian background, grew up in a Christian home, and my sort of lens and on-ramp to Christianity was really through the more of an academic perspective, academic and practical. So my father was a minister, a very educated minister. He could read the Greek New Testament, and so he took that kind of scholarship to his ministry, and then imparted that really without just, I kind of got it through osmosis, if you will, just being in the household. And so, when we talk about things like spirituality, for me at least, that was something I always kind of categorized as uh, something that could be understood through the lens of really materialism or the chemical processes of the brain, kind of really lumping it into things that maybe were just mislabeled, so that could be better understood. And so with that very sort of strongly kind of rational perspective on spirituality and spiritual experience, not that I never had friends who had spiritual experiences or heard of them, I always just sort of took those on from the vantage point of, okay, that's interesting. That's not something I've ever experienced. And whatever that is that they're sharing with me, it's probably something that they're translating to me through their lived experience. But at the root of that is something that is actually very explainable in the way that we would explain any kind of mental process, or something that we would sort of examine in a laboratory. So in a way, I kind of like made it very clinical and cold, spirituality, but they sort of secretly like really wanted that as well. I think it's important too to highlight uh, that as a human being, we have a lot of experiences that we aren't good at categorizing. So there are many things that we experience on a daily basis that we experience in a very visceral, phenomenal way, not in a examined, dissected way. And so when you talked about labels, sort of Christianity or Buddhism, I really resonate a lot with that perspective, because for me, those labels at some point in my life got in the way. They got in the way of what we were really talking about. And I find it pretty difficult and honestly disingenuous even, for people to say that they are an X, because the truth is, at least in the experience that I know, and that's all that I have to go on. At any given moment, any given day, my mental state, my lived experience is really going through a stream of different feelings and thoughts, conclusions, beliefs, and all those different things. And to say that I'm an X almost feels like it really reduces me to something that is no longer, valuable. It's if I'm calling myself a rock and I'm not a rock. So I know that I'm something else beyond that. And so, this topic, I know we're kind of getting our way there with angels and demons, but I think it's important for our listeners to understand the pathway that we both have taken to this subject. We have come at it a little differently. I've never been one that has really kind of gone hard into the experiential side of religion. I've gone into it very much from a analytical side, um, but I yearn in a way for that experiential side. And I think if in the talks that we've had, you've been much more willing, or have had moments in your life where you have embraced that experiential side more readily. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've definitely done both. I've when you're growing up, you kind of try different perspectives on reality, like a suit that you try on for a while and see how it fits until it feels too constricting or something, and then you're like, this isn't quite right. But
Mm.
I would always sort of like live it to the fullest. So I'd wear that suit proudly, and say, I'm going to say this is reality, and I'm going to try this out. And because I would push it to the nth degree, I would often, get to a point where the suit was no longer comfortable pretty quickly too.
Mm.
We can use the suit as sort of an analogy for a worldview. So I remember times where I was, in charismatic circles, and really, you have this imminent sense that God is doing something in the world, and you can feel it, and you feel like you're at the you're right at the front lines, and it's a very exciting feeling because you feel like,
Mm.
the most important things are happening right now, and we're a part of it. And And I've also been at different times in my life had a much more of a like an arm's length kind of perspective where I'm like, let me take a historical critical view of spiritual experiences and even the way we interpret previous spiritual experiences from various traditions. And so it's kind of funny, even when I think back now and I look back on it, I've almost become these like alter personalities kind of thing, and tried on both and realized that some combination of the two, or some transcendence of the two into some, that both of those were sort of two sides of the same coin that was too restrictive, but that was one developmental level, like two different sides of one developmental level. And it's only when I transcended that, and that I think the discomfort of living in both those and neither one feeling right is what births the transcendence to a higher level that's broader as well. So yeah, I would say that's been my take is sort of like trying on both to the nth degree until it transcends into something different entirely.
Mm-hmm. Well, with this topic in particular, what's your sense in which why looking at sort of UFOs or aliens, from the vantage of angels and demons, and this sort of very modern, kind of Christian good and evil dichotomy, dualism. What do you think is attractive about that perspective as it applies to the topic of UFOs?
Well, I would say, and I've said this so many times now, whether either here or on Point of Convergence, that it's almost funny now. But I almost always feel the need to give this disclaimer, which is that for many people, especially in Western civilization, we're not accustomed to dealing with different entities. Like we have a very cookie cutter kind of perspective on reality that we're here hanging out with the animals and the insects. But other than that, there's no intelligent entities around, and we also have this bias that what we perceive of the world, is an accurate portrayal, and we can get into later on how that's really almost guaranteed not to be the case now, based on research. But because of that, when people hear about
Thomas Merton. We were talking about Thomas Merton earlier. Travis Walton.
Travis Walton. Thank you. That's who I was looking for. Not Thomas Merton, Travis Walton.
Very different.
Yes. Travis Walton, when he came back and shared his experience after being, gone for like a week, one of the most famous cases in history, I think his mother, her perspective was, that sounds like demons to me. And I know if not him, then some of the other guys, that definitely was the response. So, half the town thought they were making it up, and the other half thought they were abducted by demons, right? So that's kind of like what happens. But it comes down to, again, this unfamiliarity, not so much in shamanic cultures, but in Western cultures, traditions. We have this view that, again, you either have angels and God in heaven, demons and Satan in hell, and everything else is the in-between world that we live in. And if we ever run into something that doesn't fit animal or human, it's got to be one of those other two domains. So that's why the first one, I think why that's a big reason why people jump to that quickly. The second one, again, is because of the spiritual element that I already discussed. That there's such a spiritual experience that people have. It expands their consciousness. That's usually the case, even in ones that begin as kind of negative experiences because they're so overwhelming and so, ontologically shocking, but they're also mind expanding, right? And even people like Whitley Strieber have talked about, is the stretching to the nth degree, right to the edge, your mind to the point where it almost breaks. Is that actually the birthing process for an expansion of consciousness? He's an interesting person to listen to because on the one hand, you see this guy early on when he was writing the original Communion trilogy who seemed really tormented by his experiences. And yet he wouldn't trade them looking back now, that he feels like it creates the greatest opportunity for spiritual transformation that's available to a human being in some ways. And there are other spiritual traditions, speaking of today's topic, where similar things happen. We talk about a Kundalini break, where people have an expansion of consciousness so quickly and so expansively that it basically cracks their sense of who they are for a while. And so I even know people who've been committed, into an asylum or whatever, or under care for a week or two because they've had these kind of breaking experiences. So they can be extremely disruptive. So getting back to your initial question, I think it's partly to do with the way, especially in the West, and by that I mean Western civilization, we tend to have a very truncated view of what's available in terms of who's around. And then we have the spiritual element that is so often part of these cases. And third, that they are so mind expanding. They blow apart our previous conception of reality, whether they're for the good or for the bad, or start with the bad and end with a good, whatever. They're still so mind stretching that they end up being perceived as spiritual experiences.
Right. Something you said, the way you kind of put that to me, it makes me think of the phrase sort of hegemonic frameworks, right? Which is a really awkward phrase to use, but what I'm getting at there is the way in which all of us approach experience, and we approach it from a place. We are grounded in a place, and so we have conceptions, ideas, beliefs, buckets in which we place experience. Whenever we're having any experience, we are categorizing those things into these groups that we are familiar with. And even as you sort of compare Western ways of thinking with Eastern ways of thinking, I'm reminded of sort of ways of thought that I've had in the past, where you think to yourself, well, yeah, that maybe maybe that's the way that they think, but that's very superstitious. That's very, so right there, I'm already I'm categorizing and making a value judgment and putting these beliefs, and what I have found to be very true, at least for me, is that those judgments and assumptions inevitably fall apart. So if I'm really being honest and looking at the conclusions that I come to with respect to experience, it's very rare where I will, over the course of time, come to the same conclusion about the experience. And I really think that should inform, and I know you would agree, like inform the way we look at this topic, just period. So we have this position, or this sort of, I think, unchecked assumption that the way we're looking at the phenomenon now is the way it will always be looked at. And we look back in history and say, look at the way they looked at the world, and how absolutely silly, was that perspective from where we are. And we almost, like, it's foolishly, it's as if we pretend there is no future. There is no future where there is a world looking back at us and saying the exact same thing. And so, with this topic, and I know I'm talking very, very broadly here, just about sort of frameworks generally, but I think it's an important point to make, that we come at this subject, the subject of the phenomenon, from a grounded place, and everyone comes at it from a different angle.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I really want to, put a nail in that board as well, because I think one thing we want to do with this show in general, because I know that this is the way we think about reality, is that, again, the framing is just as important as the experiences themselves. And I was thinking about what you were just saying there in terms of, I was going to say the same thing you said, and in the sense that not only will we change and will society look at these things differently in the future, but we assume that the ones from the past are just silly, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's true even of our own lives, that if I were to ask, Nathan of 10 years ago and tell you what you're doing right now, you might think that sounds insane. Like, there's no way I would ever in 10 years from now be the kind of person who does this show like this. And same thing with me. I don't think there's any way that previous iterations of myself could have predicted where I am now.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very easy for us to make the mistake of thinking, but finally, at least we're here now.
We got to figure it
So
out.
from here until the rest of our lives, it's good to know we've
Mm.
arrived. But no, that's not the case. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we will look back again and be convinced that the way we saw it now was partial and incomplete and in some ways silly.
Mm-hmm.
So part of it's just recognizing that we are the river, like we were, and you never enter the same river twice. This idea that we are not the same people. And when we look at this kind of topic, both from a cultural frame as well as a personal frame, we have to remember that, that we're moving targets. And again, how we interpret these experiences as a culture and as individuals has as much to do with our history and where we grew up and our upbringing and our socioeconomic class, even sometimes. All of that comes into how we make sense of the world, and definitely how we make sense of something as mind-boggling as the phenomenon.
Right. And with this topic in particular, so angels and demons, I mean, it maybe more so than the others. Although honestly, perhaps this one just in its way, in its sort of stark contrast, is more notably in some ways easy to chastise. And I'm saying that I'm not trying to cast too much judgment there, but when we look at the different sort of ways in which we could couch the phenomenon, it's extraterrestrial, interdimensional, ultra-terrestrial, crypto-terrestrial, whatever, those all seem a little bit more highbrow, sort of socially acceptable than angels and demons. And that framework right there, like, already puts it in a lane that in our modern Western experience is like super obvious to see. We're talking in different territory here, because there's an immediate sense that there is a cosmology there that is pretty black and white. That there is a God that these angels serve. There is a God that these demons, seem to be against. There is this, entire structure, and I recognize, even just saying that it's way more nuanced, and people that may hold this hypothesis to be valuable probably have a much more nuanced perspective on it. So I am being very reductionist, just for the sake of discussion. But I think, as you said earlier, this, looking at it from the vantage of angels and demons, I would imagine, is purely an on-ramp to something else that would come later. Because you really have two choices. So you can continue to look at it from that neatly packaged view, and then continually reinforce your boundaries and barriers so that the walls you've constructed there stay strong. And people do, they really do. Or you can wrestle with that experience, as you said, and it stretches you, and it causes you to sort of maybe look at that wall very closely and say, okay, wait, there might be some cracks here that I wasn't aware of. And this way of looking at an experience that I had, or the phenomenon that I'm reading about, it for whatever reason, just couching it as an angel or a demon, something that is pro-human and anti-human, pro-God, anti-God, like, those categories alone end up really just being insufficient. At least I think so. But I know that there are those that will, that for whatever reason, maybe very good reasons, will just sort of double down and really hold tightly to that worldview.
Yeah, and I think before we get into sort of the the origin of these terms and where they came from, and sort of walk through the history of that, which I think will be helpful for people. I would also say that the problem with whenever you try and present a hypothesis for what's going on in reality, you have to begin with a miracle to some degree. Any postulation has to begin with, if you give me this, I will then build the rest for you, right? But because we can't touch that first thing, that first primary thing, we have to sort of dream up what it is and then go from there. The challenge with the angel and demon hypothesis, in terms of taking a very sort of traditional Christian perspective, fundamentalist Christian perspective, because again, later on we can get into how specific within the broad brush of Christianity, how specific that particular kind of coining was, specifically even amongst some of the federal government. But what I want to get at is that to some degree, this just begs the question, because if you say these are the angels and demons from the Bible, then you say, okay, well, what are the angels and demons in the Bible? Um, the Bible is, with my biblical studies background, I'm very happy to say that it is the record of human interaction with phenomena over time, recorded across time, which includes both the experiences with the phenomena, but also with these different phenomena, but also with a shifting perspective amongst those different human groups. So, as much as in some circles that I was in the past, where they want to pretend that the Bible is one book and it's put together nicely and it reflects sort of one theology throughout, one perspective, not the case at all. When you look at it, from a historical critical point of view, you do textual analysis, you become aware of the context of the cultures where they were written, very different cultures, written over thousands of years, right? So we're talking about a long time. And some of it borrowed from previous traditions, even though that'll be controversial for some people. So all that is to say, if that's the case, we look at the Bible that way, or any kind of scriptural text, then you see it as human beings trying to wrestle honestly and with sincerity with their God, with their conception of God, and with their conception of these otherworldly entities, and trying to make sense of what this means. And from this, they form a mythology. And I mean mythology not in the sense of they make stuff up, but it's a story by which we frame our reality. For you and I to get up in the morning and decide to brush our teeth, we have to have some idea of what life's about and why we're doing it. And presumably it's even if it evolves, it's an enduring myth because we do the same thing every day generally, right? So
that's right.
We must, even if it's in the background, we all have this narrative framework by which we navigate our lives. So again, getting back to the angels and demons thing, even if you think that's what they are, even if you think that, the question of whether or not you take the interpretation of a particular group at a particular time of what those experiences were. I mean, I'm very happy to say the Bible is recording real experiences. And I've been in academic settings where the assumption was those weren't real experiences because we know those things can't happen.
Right.
I no longer believe that because I've some of my own experiences and knowing so many other people who've had these experiences. So they're real experiences, but the question of what they mean and what they are is a different matter entirely. And I think that's partly what we're doing today is trying to separate those two matters.
Yeah, completely agree. And I would encourage anyone, no matter where you are with this topic, let's say that you are very firmly rooted in a biblical, kind of context and worldview perspective. Go to that text and do look at how this issue is wrestled with over the span of that entire story. Because as you pointed out, there is a variance there. There is a changing narrative of how these non-human entities are experienced, recorded, reflected on, and it carries through as well. So it's not just you can't just take a chapter from the Old Testament and say, okay, well that's how it was. It's sort of fixed right there. You actually can see in many places where in the New Testament language they are reinterpreting, reimagining what that story was like from the Old Testament, because it's part of their cultural framework as well, which changed over time, and maybe that's a very good segue, sort of to unpacking this a little bit more in that, in something that maybe not everyone is particularly familiar with, but where does our sort of modern notion, and I should say modern popular notion, maybe the best way to say it, of angels and demons, where does that ultimately kind of trace back to, if we're going really through the lens of the Bible and the peoples of the Bible, where's this concept coming from, and what ways has it changed over time in that text to now?
Yeah, and I think as we begin this journey, I would just say again, we're not here to try and invalidate anyone's personal experience or interpretation. We all have them, just like we talked about. Nathan and Exo have theirs as well, and they're different than they were 5 years ago, and they'll be different again in 5 years from now. So we're not pretending that we are, above that, because it's just part of the human condition. You can't get up in the morning and go about your day without a narrative framework. But that said, what often happens in history is that when different groups come into power, I mean, when they have societal power and authority, right? And by that, we basically mean they have the power of the state behind them, right? The founding fathers of our country, had to wrestle with how that had been a problem in Europe, for instance, and trying to separate this all. And how do you guarantee the freedom of an individual to pursue, life, liberty, and happiness, while also allowing for spirituality, but not centralizing it within a state kind of thing, right? So what happened was, initially the term demon is sort of like a co-opting of a much older sort of term from Greek mythology, and even before that, that we'll use the term daemon. It can sometimes be pronounced demon as well, but so we're clear to people about which one we're talking about. I'm going to say daemon. So when I say daemon, I'm referring to sort of the Greek mythology. And these were figures who were, and I'll get in a second to how that got co-opted later. But this initial sort of understanding was that there are entities, intelligences, beings that people encounter that are sort of somewhere between divine and mortal, or they have some characteristics that seem to be like they live in both worlds. They're in a liminal frame, and there was a range. It's not like they were either good or bad or one or the other. It's that they, just like you go to the supermarket, you get a range of people with different backgrounds and a range of whether you would call them good or bad people or whatever. If we realize that's kind of simplistic and black and white. Well, in the same way that the original understanding was that there was a breadth and depth to these beings that sort of covered the gamut. And there was also sort of this sense sometimes that great figures, human figures, when they died, heroic figures, would become like demonic figures for people in the future. And there was also a sense of kind of like a protecting or a guardian angel or demon or daemon kind of notion as well, that you're born with a daemon that's with you through your whole life kind of thing, and is guiding you and giving you feedback and whatnot. But what happened was when Christianity kind of rose to power in the Roman Empire, what often happens is that traditions that are already existing end up being sort of brought into the mix. Because if it's a tradition that's already really embedded in a culture, it's hard to just say, okay, you can't do that anymore, right? So instead, it gets altered, it gets modified, it mutates and becomes part of the new dominant system. So, when you have Constantine, adopting Christianity and then sort of saying this is going to be the official religion of the empire, then what happens is that other aspects of the cultural mix get brought in as well. So even things like everything from like a Christmas tree, right, was a part of a pagan tradition, but got kind of brought in. And now if you were to tell a modern American, evangelical that a Christmas tree was originally a pagan ceremony, they would be, horrified and shocked, but that's the truth, right? In the same way, the daemons, that then the Christian sort of hierarchy had to figure out, the elite in that now only had power not only in the church but over the society as well. They were the lawmaker, the judge, everything. They had to figure out, what do we do with these demonic figures? And so there was a notion in Christianity, this sort of creation story where, as you alluded to, there was one really amazing creature. The story goes like the most beautiful and amazing and powerful creature that God had ever created, so much so that, kind of got a big head about him and sort of rebelled against God and was cast out of heaven, right? This is the creation myth. And along with him, a bunch of the other angelic figures that were on the scene also sort of like sided with this satanic figure. And by the way, speaking of shifting perspectives, that Satan figure in early sort of Hebrew scriptures was coined very differently, sort of part of the council of the Godhead. Really gets complex once you really look at it. But anyway, so the idea is that, this satanic figure was cast out of heaven. damned to hell, this different landscape, this different domain or realm.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the angels went with him, were cast out that sort of aligned with him. And then left in heaven was God and the angels that stayed on the good side.
Right.
So these are all of the spiritual entities that were coined in that tradition. So what Christianity did when it came into power was said, okay, yes, there are daemons, but they're actually all one of these two types. They're either angels or demons according to this creation myth. And that's how that kind of got co-opted and shifted and mutated over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and I would encourage people. There's just a lot of really great material out there, and it would take way more than an hour and a half episode to unpack this. But so I would encourage folks to really dive into this subject. There's some great content on YouTube on the history of demonic entities. Also, I would encourage folks to look at the influence of Hellenism, which was Greek culture, on the Bible, both on the Jewish tradition, pre-Christianity, as well as on Christianity itself, because you really cannot separate those things. That it's all in the mix there, and I think that opens up. For a believer, I honestly think it actually provides a richer landscape to your belief to understand that was sort of the world in which these texts emerged. And for those who aren't a believer, I think it will provide you with a little greater clarity on how some of these ideas sort of came to be and adopted and changed over time. I'm particularly struck, talking about changing over time, the power of this idea of monotheism. And the adoption of monotheism by Constantine, and then really that becoming kind of the dominant worldview and theology in the Western and what Western societies. When you kind of go down that path, anything that is against that monotheistic idea, that is against God, and in many cases was associated the state. So it would be, whoever was the emperor or the king. They were very closely aligned to the church. So anything that is not in that category, again, we talk about this notion of buckets and frameworks. If you're not in that category, that very narrow slice, then you are, just by definition, you're not. You're on the opposition. And so as the Roman culture advanced into Europe, and had to intermingle with the cultures that were there, they are taking on the Norse mythology, and putting those things as oftentimes demoting those deities into the demonic category as well. So this is just sort of a natural way in which thought frames, really have a life of their own and begin acting in the world to parse experience and categorize different groups. So all that being said, which is, quite a bit there to kind of think about. And again, we could do a lot more on it. I know we want to talk about something kind of much more specific, and this is very interesting to me, and that is the sort of rumors, or even in many places reported as true, preponderance of belief in some circles of the U.S. intelligence community that this is what it really is, that it is angels and demons, that it is a very strongly held sort of Christian. There's an end times narrative. There's very much this coming apocalypse. All of these sort of loaded terms seem to be closely held beliefs by at least some of the folks who might be closest to the study of what this really is. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, what's interesting about that is that, again, we can't separate the interpretation from the landscape that these people live within, right? And we want to make it really clear, we're not mocking anyone for having an interpretive grid. We all have it. It's part of being a human being. And usually what happens is any modern culture tends to look back at the past and sort of mock and laugh at the previous iterations, only because the current mythology is worn so tightly that you don't see it. It's the pair of glasses you're wearing constantly. So you think you finally achieved objectivity where every previous culture has not. Again, with my integral background, I'm kind of immunized against that notion that I know it keeps rolling out. And that's an iterative process that keeps happening, that's emergent, and there will be new ways of seeing reality that will be better and more transcendent and more inclusive in the future than I or anyone else can imagine yet. That's just the way it goes. So, with that in mind, again, that everyone grows up in an era when there's cultural frameworks all around them, whether they're aware of them or not. We have to remember that because this is interesting. I've had people, after I did the one podcast episode on the Collins Elite, and which is the sort of unofficial name that was given to this group of people within the U.S. intelligence community who came to believe that these were demons,
Yeah.
right? So it's a really fascinating case. And I've had people write me and say, surely these people with security clearances and sometimes high degrees of education couldn't be fooled just by interpretive grids. And I want to say to people, yes, they can. I mean, not that there weren't real events, and we'll get to those.
Mm-hmm.
We want to really get into that today. But don't dismiss or look the other way from how powerful these interpretive grids are. An experience is one thing. How you land it, ground it, make sense of it is another thing. And it has as much to do with your interpretive grid as it does the experience itself. So we have to sort of put this in context of history. So what happens is, I think when you look back at it as objectively as possible, and by the way, Nick Redfern wrote a book called Final Events. Speaking of the sort of apocalyptic nature you sort of touched on, that book's comes highly recommended. He documented a lot of this where he kept an objective perspective. He didn't adopt the perspective of the Collins Elite. He tried to just talk about the experiences, the events historically, and then what they concluded and why they concluded that. And what you come away with, as I said in that podcast episode, is a lot of correlation, but not necessarily causation in my mind. And I think that from my perspective, what the Collins Elite did a lot of was assuming one implies the other. So you had things like, it sort of goes back to Aleister Crowley, in the late 19th century, and he's a controversial figure. People in occultic circles he's kind of a heroic figure who tried to break through the membrane to some other dimensions and make contact with beings. So that's one framing, right? People see him as a kind of heroic pioneering figure, but there's some people in Christian traditions who think that's a foolish man who is messing with demonic entities that never ends well for you, right? So, so he began some stuff in the late 19th century, reaching across, and part of the narrative that began to be reinterpreted. Again, we talked about Christian traditions, and Hellenistic, aspects getting boiled into the mix. In the same way, in the 40s or so, 40s and 50s with the Collins Elite, they looked back at things, maybe that there was a portal opened by Aleister Crowley. They looked back at these historic events where people were trying to reach across, and even if they thought they were well-meaning and were trying to just contact other beings, from the Christian fundamentalist perspective, the only door you're knocking on is the satanic realm, the doors of hell, the gates of hell, right? And so they believe that Crowley opened that portal, right? And so that could have cracked open the door for spiritual entities to come in. And then you have people like Jack Parsons later on, who were devotees of Crowley, who also he had his own rocket company and worked for, was developed rockets for NASA and stuff, was very intelligent guy with a high security clearance. And yet he had these kind of occultic practices in the background, right, that he was interested in. we even have people like Kenneth Arnold, the man who saw the first saucers, right, around Mount Rainier, that sort of was the birth of the entire sort of 20th century flying saucer thing that took off in the U.S., right? He actually was someone that knew Jack Parsons. And so what happened is the Collins elite started ticking off boxes, right? And they said, aha, Jack Parsons was a devotee of Aleister Crowley, right? Kenneth Arnold knew Jack Parsons. And so they start seeing like this nefarious causal link between these different figures. And we have to say some people had negative experiences.
Yeah.
Some people really had scary experiences with entities they perceived as nefarious. And so, for Jack Parsons, there's this famous, how his life ended is kind of famous because, or infamous, depending on your point of view, because there was an explosion and he died, got as far as the hospital, but died there. Some people believe that he was, again, trying to engage in some sort of occultic practice and ended up opening a portal, which caused an explosion and killed him. Again, from the fundamentalist Christian perspective held by some in the Collins elite, most of them, again, even if you think you're doing something funny or fun or exciting, it never ends well for you because these are deceptive entities, right? That's a key part, that they're deceptive. So he died in this explosion. Some people look at it like perhaps he was engaged in some sort of occultic practice that went bad. Other people say, no, he was just working on, rocket technology because that's what he was. He was a rocket scientist. And that was all that was an accident, nothing more than that. But this deception part is key because the Collins elite believe that the flying saucer mythology, right, that sort of rose up in the 20th century, speaking of framing, was just a deceptive front. It was the veneer, the facade of what was actually demonic activity. And so that's the key, that again, the interpretive grid already told them that, and if you talk to anyone or you've been in fundamentalist Christian circles, you'll know that people take passages from the Bible, like, Satan can parade as an angel of light, and they really can apply that across the board and say, so you could see something that looks like shining and glorious and beautiful and angelic, still Satan, man.
Right.
And I'm not trying to be, totally dismissive there, but it is sometimes frustrating how people are not willing to ever question that theology because it basically is non-dismissible, right? It's you can never disprove it because you just say no matter how good it looks, it's probably demonic still because it can fool you, right? So they really believe that yes, they were manifesting as saucers, they were manifesting as UFOs. People really were having these experiences, but really what they were was like demonic alchemy, basically the fruit of demonic alchemy, and that it was that a satanic ruse designed to ultimately, try and rob people's souls, leading up to the final battle in the apocalypse, Armageddon, as depicted again according to some people's interpretation of the Book of Revelation, the end times. All of that was so. When you start tying it all together, you see that it's an interesting combination of historical events that did happen, some negative experiences people did have, and a group of people who already were immersed in this interpretive framework. And you put that all together, and that's how you end up with something like the Collins elite.
Yeah. Well, and that's the power of these eschatological, sort of narratives, right? That it's not that they just take something from the past. They must include elements of the present. And so, the degree to which you are very much an active participant in that eschatology, is what in large part gives it its power. And so, I think that coming back to what you said about the importance of acknowledging and not demeaning where people come at this from, I find that to be a very valuable point, because we can really break down this topic and I think be quite reductionistic and really place a lot of value judgment on it as a framework for understanding what is going on. But there is a different path that we could take, when looking at this hypothesis, and I think any hypothesis, quite frankly, and that is the path that seeks to find the greater truth at play with the underlying assumptions, right? So if we're couching this as angels and demons, we are applying this sort of pro human, anti human, sort of pro soul, anti soul, these are concepts that are at play. Also, as you mentioned, the trickster element is very much part of the sort of popular demon lore, and then in the daemon and the demonic entity concept, this notion of ambiguity is very important, plays a very sort of important role. And when we look at the phenomenon, what do we see? We see quite a lot of ambiguity. We see quite a lot of trickster elements. We see some experiences that are interpreted very negatively, sort of anti-self, anti-human, even though later on they may, as you said, become reinterpreted as being the opposite of that. And we also see plenty of experiences that are interpreted incredibly positively. So as couched in the messenger sort of motif that angels are traditionally understood. Messengers of the divine and intermediaries between God and humanity. And so, how many stories we'd be here all night, try to count them, of instances where people were given a message about whatever, it was important to know of the time. And so, when you look at it from that perspective and trying to kind of come up above the surface, it's easy to see, I think, some things that we can celebrate in this concept. But I think you and I would probably just sort of say it's important to be able to challenge the core the notions themselves. It's not necessarily that it's wrong to have these perspectives, but we need to at the same time be able and willing to unpack them and examine them from different perspectives. And then if they still hold true for you, well, that's okay. And I think that is fine. But if you haven't gone through that process, it's probably worthwhile to do so.
I agree. And I think too, I think you made a really good point about the ambiguity. I think that we really have to look that in the face, and say, if your current narratives, no matter how much you try and fit these different phenomena into these narratives, if they always end up looking ambiguous, it's probably a good sign that whatever hypothesis you're putting forward is incomplete and has either some only partial truth or perhaps some notions of reality that are completely off. And something I've sort of done historically in trying my darndest to make sense of what's going on is to come to ever more sort of transcendent and inclusive, again from an integral point of view, hypotheses that can make sense of the vast panorama of experiences that people have. And it, I saw someone today on UFO Twitter say, listen, these aliens are taking women and impregnating them and then stealing their babies in the middle of the night. That's not okay. And I totally get that perspective. I mean, when someone says it, lays it out like that, it's hard to disagree, right? And that would be criminal activity in a court of law, right? Mm-hmm. For sure. But then there's another entire narrative around people who later on realized they made a soul agreement in between lifetimes, and they were once a hybrid themselves, or they are a hybrid, or they agreed to have hybrid children, that they just lost touch with a certain modality of themselves. So I would say that you somehow have to keep reaching for a hypothesis that's broad enough, that's deep enough to make sense of all of these different experiences, not just the experiences themselves, not just the many different kinds of entities and craft that are described, but also how broad the assortment of interpretations of the experiences. Like, you have to make sense of all of that. I mean, I feel like I've made some headway in that, and sort of like have some conceptions now of how to make sense of that. But what made me move away from any of the previous conceptions was recognizing that there's some data that just didn't fit, and I wasn't comfortable saying this is pretty good. This gets like 80%, but there's this 20%, steaming pile of refuse that like refuses to be ignored, and it's like, do you want simple answers or do you want truth? And if it doesn't make sense of all the data yet, keep trying, keep looking. That's an invitation to another layer of depth, and the goal being eventually trying to make sense not of just the depth and breadth of the experiences themselves, but the entities themselves, all of it. And this spiritual element, getting down to this angels, demons. I like the way you put it: pro-human, anti-human, pro-soul, anti-soul. Because even within ufology, you get like an allies of humanity kind of notion, right? You get people who say, no, this is kind of about ETs, but there's different ET groups. Some are for us, some are against us, some are trying to enslave us. For some, we're like farm animals, property. This gets tossed around a lot, right? And we have these like notions of like terror overcome us when we suddenly realize, what if we're just like grazing on farmland to some of these beings. All that is to say, all of these notions, I think we have to, in other words, it's not just trying to dismiss or belittle narrow spiritual interpretations, because again, even for people who want to keep it just as physical entities, there are some notions that still seem pretty black and white and pretty like cookie cutter, good aliens, bad aliens, and if the data feels like it's just not quite fitting, when you hear someone say, my take is it's this is what's going on, and you just have this nagging feeling that awkwardly fits with the data and maybe just ignores some data, then I think that's an invitation to keep looking, keep exploring, and see where you end up.
Well, and what in the tradition of that view, looking back at interpretations that have been given in history of the phenomenon, a phenomenal experience, I think it's safe to say that it does change, right? So, we haven't quite touched on this component of it, but you definitely do see it in the literature, and particularly if you look at this from a very, very broad view, which we have been with, talking about the Bible and Greek culture. There is this sense in which the clothing, if you will, of the phenomenon literally changes over time, and that, you and I have talked about this. That is a signpost to something truer in and of itself. So we do. I think it is easy for us to approach this topic the way that we have, largely on this show, kind of looking at it pretty critically, and I mean that in just sort of an objective analysis sort of way, not judgmental per se. Looking at it from the standpoint of cultural frameworks, but really it could be just as equally valid to say that the phenomenon itself literally has represented itself to humanity differently over time. And what might that imply? What might that mean for what it truly is?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating aspect to bring in, and I agree with you that we have to. But even the way we just coined it there, you could see it differently. You could say, is it that they are clothing themselves differently, or that we are always an inevitable aspect of the framing itself?
Right.
That something about our consciousness, as much as we talk about some notion that they can manipulate our consciousness, but putting that aside for a second, to what degree is it possible that, in the same way that I mentioned, the biblical texts cover a large period of time and many different cultures, different ways of seeing the world, and when you're honest about it, when you look at it, in close detail, you see those differences over time. So what I was saying was that really what the Bible is a document, historical document, referencing not just experiences with God and spiritual entities, but people's interpretation of what that meant for reality and the way that they experienced the world. As that shifted, that also changed their perspective of God. So some people will look at the New Testament and say you have a picture of a loving God in the New Testament and more of a judgmental, harsh kind of, angry, damning kind of God in the Old Testament. And but even that's too simplistic, because the Old Testament covers a long period of time and different frameworks. So what I'm getting at there is that what the Bible is a historical record of humanity's shifting perspective with spiritual phenomena. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way, the way that we've coined and described and understood the different experiences with the phenomenon over time, yes, it could be that they've changed the way they appear, or that perhaps that they're wise enough to know what we expect, and so they show up in a way as to sort of interact with our framings as they exist. Or you could even say, kind of like an interference pattern, that the way they manifest is always going to be a combination of who they are and what we expect them to be, or what we have even on our unconscious palette of what can manifest and what reality is comprised of. All of those factors combine to create something that actually shows up in what looks like manifest reality. And of course, when you get there, as you know, I've kind of been going down that path, then that lands you at the point where you say, okay, our entire understanding of what reality is, it now shifts. But from my point of view, again, when I was mentioning a while ago, keep going deeper, keep going broader, keep reaching until you have something that makes sense. I think that's where you have to end up. That our current models of reality, as they're often described, cannot make sense of this with any of the known players: ETs, cryptoterrestrials, ultraterrestrials, interdimensionals. None of them quite fit, because I think all of those, to some degree, are born out of our current model, like within physics, of what constitutes reality. And I think when none of those quite fit, inevitably you end up at, it's the model of reality that is off. And until we have that evolve into something else, we're not going to be able to make sense of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm really sort of struck with the truth that the tensions between certainty and change, right? So we really want certainty. We want to believe in a reality that is fixed. And even in most mythologies, and quite frankly, our cosmologies too, in many respects, we approach them from the vantage point that there are these variables that are fixed in that equation, that they themselves do not change. They themselves are not dynamic. And I wonder whether that is a false assumption, that we really have to work hard and kind of fight hard against that compulsion. So we really, for most of the topics that we're going to cover, there is this strong compulsion, at least that I feel, to say, you know what, that's it. We nailed it. It is this. It's going to go in this box. We've solved it. Let's move on. And I think the longer that I study this and really reflect not only on this topic, but really any subject that has been valuable to my own life, I have to be honest with the fact that I would prefer it not to be solved. That I would rather it be always in flux. And not only would I prefer it, but in reality, it is constantly changing and will constantly change. So I think coming to that place, that realization, when you approach this topic, is very healthy. And you and I have talked about this a lot. The people that have studied this often the most have landed in a place where they say they don't really know all that there is. They have not come to some firm conclusions. And I think we need to take them at their word. They've spent in many cases their lives devoted to the study of this. And if they're saying that, our search for easy answers, I think should be really called into question there.
Yeah, it comes back to that phrase I mentioned earlier about you never enter the same river twice.
Mm-hmm.
That's true of our lives. It's true of the different, like you say, these poles that we prefer to be cemented into the ground, that they're always going to be in the same place, but they're not. And you think about even how human beings, not all that long ago, didn't make it past 30 or 40 years old,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so you didn't have a lot of time nor rich cultural experiences to begin to shift your perspective on what reality was, right? That wasn't common. You had long periods of history where there not much changed, in terms of the cosmology and whatnot. Now, again, as I mentioned before, with the whole technological singularity thing, we're racing at breakneck speed
Mm-hmm.
between, towards some penultimate point that's, no one knows what's going to be on the other side of it. But yeah, it's even interesting for us as 21st century people to recognize that we live long enough now, if we're lucky, to really be able to live through these
Mm-hmm.
changes, not just the way that society has changed. Some of the things that are not okay culturally now were not the case when you and I were teenagers. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
it's amazing to go, and we both have kids, and our kids probably can't imagine that there ever was a world where that was okay,
Mm-hmm.
but there was, and we're not even that old, and yet we remember when that was the case. And so, yes, you can either become overwhelmed by that, you can become unmoored by that, or you can learn to swim,
Mm-hmm.
or just recognize you're on the boat, you're part of the river, you go with it. And I agree with you too that I do feel like I've had some breakthroughs in terms of understanding how a model of reality would have to shift to make sense of more of these kinds of experiences. But even then, I still think inevitably, like I was mentioning with integral theory and developmental levels that come online over time, um, you're always unwrapping the onion.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it is, and just be comfortable with that. And embrace the adventure, the experience, and I think even the ultimate, directionality of the cosmos with a K, like the interior and the exterior cosmos.
Mm-hmm.
Is that it? That's it. It's a journey, and that, we often have this phrase, the journey is half the fun, right? Or, sometimes when you get there, you're like, getting there was what really was exciting. And I think that's both you and I kind of take that perspective, both out of necessity, because you recognize no simple answers are going to fit here. But just the nature of reality, and being a sentient being living in this reality means that it will always be shifting. And what I find exciting about that is that you have ever more transcendent, meaningful ways of framing, and that your sense of self becomes ever more expansive. So it's always an additive kind of process.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, if you're seeking for simple certitude, this is the wrong business to be in.
No, that's so true. Well, as we kind of steer toward the end of the show, what would be your advice to someone who finds themselves situated in looking at the phenomenon from this perspective right now? Or if you were in dialogue with someone who had that perspective, how would you approach that conversation, in that relationship? What kinds of things would you want to touch on or discuss or challenge, if any? Where do you meet someone who has a view that may be counter to a conclusion that you've come to about what it might be?
Well, I think, one of the perspectives I have, and this is in being a human being who's evolved through different worldviews myself, right? So I can almost imagine trying to have a conversation with myself, 15 years ago or whatever. And what I would say about that experience is just as true as talking to someone else. And that is that all you can ever do is meet someone where they are.
Mm-hmm.
You have to try and help them develop a more mature well-rounded view where they are. If they are ever to perhaps transcend that and have a different view that's sort of more transcendent and inclusive of larger territory,
Mm-hmm.
then you have to meet them where they are, and you have to start where they are, and you have to ask questions, get them to think about things within that perspective. Because, like I said before, with my different historical iterations, wearing different suits until it no longer felt comfortable. If people are sincere and they're really trying to find truth, then I think you just maybe interject some of the data that doesn't fit with their current perspective. And I would want other people to do the same for me.
Mm-hmm.
We're not immune to this, and do it respectfully. Like, not to be dismissive. There are, again, I'm frequently amazed that I run into people who want to paint this entire thing as love and light, and that anybody who has a negative experience either has psychological problems, or they're making it up, or they were convinced by someone else who told them freaky things. So you have some people who, again, come in with a predetermined perspective and exclude any outlier data.
Mm-hmm.
Coming from the love and light perspective. And you also get the people who are coming from the demonic perspective, who are convinced that, these might look like ETs, but they are inevitably, ultimately, these nefarious interdimensional entities that are the very beings that were cast out of heaven, that are the servants of Satan, that also, whenever they hear about any outlier data to their perspective, like, well, they healed me, or they healed my dog, or they've shown me things that have made me more loving and accepting of others. They'll say, well, that's just a ruse, and none of that really matters, because you're going to lose your soul in the process, and then you're going to spend eternity with Satan and those demons,
Mm-hmm.
and then you'll see them for what they are, and you'll regret the whole thing. You see my point.
Mm-hmm.
In both cases, you have exclusion of data,
Mm-hmm.
and in the process of trying to defend a predetermined position. So I would encourage everyone to not opt for those easy solutions. If you take anything from what we're saying, it's that there's a depth and a breadth of data that covers the gamut. Some people who want to say that even negative experiences ultimately are just positive experiences that just haven't been seen in the right light yet.
Mm-hmm.
There are other people who get really frustrated with that and feel like it blockades truth, because there's the truth for some people is that these have always been and always will be negative experiences. As we've said many times before, even for those who end up with a positive interpretation, ultimately, like a Whitley Strieber, they were extremely traumatic, always ontologically shocking. They tear your life apart. Even if they ultimately ends up being rebuilt into something more transcendent and beautiful, there's a middle process that's no fun, where your cognitive dissonance is off the charts, right? So, I would just say that's how I would interact with people, is try to point them towards some of the data that maybe their current model doesn't fit, and that's on both sides of the spectrum. And we're not trying to dismiss anyone. The perspective I like to bring to people in general is that most people are doing the best they can to show up in life as best they can and make sense of the world and do what they think their transcendent idea of what ultimate spirituality is wants them to do. That's what everyone's trying to do. And so I think we want to honor that that intention in people, and try and meet people where they are, and just see where the conversation goes.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's important to recognize where someone is situated, and if they feel that it makes sense of the world they find themselves, if it helps them to navigate that world, interact in a healthy way with other people, and they don't really want to rock that boat. They're not looking to rock that boat. I don't necessarily see it as my job to be the boat rocker. At the same time, if they do seem interested in exploring new territory, or firming up the beliefs that they currently have, then I completely concur, and that's what I would want to tell myself too. If I were to go back and talk to my younger self, it would be to say, I know you've got some pretty good opinions, pretty strong opinions about what you think is going on. Take those opinions and put them against some of the data, some of the other experience that you may be less comfortable confronting. And how do you wrestle with that and make sense of it? It's much the same way that I would encourage people who feel very comfortable where they live to travel and see other parts of the world. That through travel you gain a new appreciation, I think, for what you have, where you are, where you've come from, and you incorporate the experience that you gain. So it's very much not a process or experience that belittles what you have. It actually expands what you have, expands your understanding, and hopefully makes that in the end a richer exercise, a more valuable, meaningful life. And that I'm reminded frequently, quite frankly, that in our search for the truth with a capital T, that our search for disclosure with a capital D, we really want these things so badly. And I do go through this sort of imaginative exercise. Okay, what if you got those things? What if those things came tomorrow? What does Nathan still have to do? So who does Nathan still have to be? And I think these are the ultimate questions that we have to wrestle with, because there's not, if we have this notion that there's someone coming to save us, there's this salvific expectation. I really think that will be that is misplaced. And that is quite frankly pretty reductionist, and flattens the lived experience. So we really have to be true to what we value most in life, and that is relationship and experience itself, and novelty and beauty, and all of these things, when you think about them, are very dynamic. They are not static.
Totally. And I think that, when you get on a platform like UFO Twitter, rather than saying, those are the nuts and bolts crowd, and this is the spiritually transcendent crowd, and this is the, whatever crowd, remember that they're all human beings, and therefore have more in common with you than they don't. And yeah, I think that sometimes, as much as we legitimately ask ourselves, why are we so fascinated with this topic, drawn into it? And we discussed last time how partly it's because it touches on all the big questions, the most transcendent questions about why we're here, where we're going, all that. But we also don't want to let that become, excuse not to live our lives. That you have to make sure that this is not just a sort of a fill-in or stand-in for not being comfortable in your own skin, kind of thing. And I always, encourage, speaking of spirituality, people having a meditative practice, not just because it becomes a way to potentially reach across the veil and experience other entities and other aspects of reality in the stream of consciousness, but also because it stops the mental activity, all the guessing games that go on that become its own thing, right? Because we become defined by, and it lets you sit in your own skin and just be, and not have to know. And to be in that moment, in the now, is enough. And to really not just tell yourself that intellectually, but get to the point where it feels that way, that I really would encourage people to do that. And I was thinking about what you said about, if we finally did get the answer, or if we finally did get capital T disclosure or capital D disclosure, I'm reminded of that, proverb that says, before enlightenment, chop wood, fold laundry. After enlightenment, chop wood, fold laundry. In other words, your perspective may shift, might become more transcendent, might become deeper, richer, but remember to show up, live your life, treat other people as human beings, and let's not divide over these, arbitrary lines between how we interpret this phenomenon, and let's keep the conversation going. And I hope that for people who've tuned in today, I hope we didn't mean to dismiss anyone's perspective. We're not trying to claim that we're right, that we, if you just align with us, you'll be good to go. We're trying to admit that we believe ourselves that we are moving targets, and that 5 years from now, our future selves will want to come back and have a conversation with our current selves and suggest some shifts and some new data that we hadn't considered right now. So, like we've been saying all along, this is just a journey. Let's enjoy it. Let's treat it like an adventure, and let's keep going.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm grateful to be on this journey with you and with our listeners. We've gotten a lot of excellent feedback from our listeners, and look forward to receiving more feedback as time goes on. We do encourage folks to engage with us. We love reading your comments on YouTube, or anyone that sends us a message on Twitter. Very much welcome all of the feedback that we receive. You can find our show on most podcast platforms. You can search under Liminal Frames, on YouTube under the ExoAcademian YouTube channel. And then if you want to find us kind of on our personal Twitter accounts, you can find me at AwaifSoul, and then Exo at ExoAcademian. It's been a pleasure covering this topic today. It felt very personal for me in a way that I think I wasn't expecting, and I very much enjoyed it. But looking forward to the next episode.
Yeah, myself also. And just as a quick reminder on the liminal frames, you probably already know this if you're listening to this, but spelt with a PH. So don't forget that if you're looking for it, look for frames with a PH. I enjoyed it too. And again, like we've mentioned before, we really hope that this becomes a conversation that includes more than just the two of us. So we do hope people give us feedback, give us thoughts, give us ideas on what they'd like to see in future shows. We've even talked about maybe doing a show in the future where we engage with listener questions for the entire 90 minutes. So if you have burning questions you would like to have us engage with to do with the phenomenon, or, high strangeness in general, please let us know. If you think there's some aspect that you think we are underrepresenting or too dismissive of, let us know that as well. We might not agree, but we're always open to hearing other perspectives. And we really do want this to be a wide-reaching conversation with many people.
Absolutely. And now we'll close with our benediction. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. And as always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.